Guten Tag, and welcome back to Baby Alice's stories. We now return to our journey to the center of the earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 17, Vertical Descent. Now began our real journey. Hitherto our toil had overcome all difficulties. Now, difficulties would spring up at every step. I had not yet ventured to look down the bottomless pit into which I was about to take a plunge. The supreme hour had come. I might now either share in the enterprise or refuse to move forward. But I was ashamed to recoil in the presence of the hunter. Hans accepted the enterprise with such calmness, such indifference, such perfect disregard of any possible danger, that I blushed at the idea of being less brave than he. If I had been alone, I might have once more tried the effect of argument. But in the presence of the guide, I held my peace. My heart flew back to my sweet Verlan days, and I approached the central chimney. I have already mentioned that I was 100 feet in diameter and 300 feet round. I bent over a projecting rock and gazed down. My hair stood on end with terror. The bewildering feeling of vacuity laid hold upon me.
Vacuity.
Vacuity. The lack of thought or intelligence, empty-headedness, empty space, emptiness. I felt my center of gravity shifting in its place, and giddiness mounting into my brain like drunkenness. There is nothing more treacherous than this attraction down deep abysses. I was just about to drop down when a hand laid hold of me. It was that of Hans. I suppose I had not taken as many lessons on golf exploration as I ought to have done in the Frelserskirk at Copenhagen. But, however short was my examination of this well, I had taken some account of its conformation. Its almost perpendicular walls were bristling with innumerable projections which would facilitate the descent. But if there was no want of steps, still there was no rail. A rope fastened to the edge of the aperture might have helped us down. But how were we to unfasten it when arrived at the other end? My uncle employed a very simple expedient to obviate this difficulty. He uncoiled the cord of the thickness of a finger and 400 feet long. First, he dropped half of it down. Then he passed it round a lava block that projected conveniently and threw the other half down the chimney. Each of us could then descend by holding with the hand both halves of the rope, which would not be able to unroll itself from its hold. When 200 feet down, it would be easy to get possession of the whole of the rope by letting one end go and pulling down by the other. Then the exercise would go on again ad infinitum. Now, said my uncle, after having completed these preparations, now, let us look to our loads. I will divide them into 3 lots. Each of us will strap one upon his back. I mean only fragile articles. Of course, they were not included under that head. Hans, said he. Hans, said he, will take charge of the tools and a portion of the provisions. You, Axel, will take another third of the provisions and the arms, and I will take the rest of the provisions and the delicate instruments. What? Said I. The clothes and that mass of ladders and ropes, what is to become of them? They will go down by themselves. How so? I asked. You will see presently. My uncle was always willing to employ magnificent resources. Obeying orders, Hans tied all the non-fragile articles in one bundle, corded them firmly, and set them boldly down the gulf before us. I listened to the dull thuds of the descending bale. My uncle, leaning over the abyss, followed the descent of the luggage with a satisfied nod, and only rose erect when he had quite lost sight of it. Very well, now it's our turn. Now I asked any sensible man if it was possible to hear those words without a stutter, without a shudder. The professor fastened his package of instruments upon his shoulders. Hans took the tools, I took the arms, and the descent commenced in the following order: Hans, my uncle, and myself. It was effected in profound silence, broken only by the descent of loosened stones down the dark gulf. I dropped, as it were, frantically clutching the double cord with one hand and buttressing myself from the wall with the other by means of my stick. One idea overpowered me almost: fear lest the rock should give way from which I was hanging. This cord seemed a fragile thing for 3 persons to be suspended from. I made as little use of it as possible, performing wonderful feats of equilibrium upon the lava projections which my foot seemed to catch hold of like a hand. When one of these slippery steps shook under the heavier form of Hans, he said in his tranquil voice, "Give act!" "Attention!" repeated my uncle. In half an hour we were standing upon the surface of a rock, jammed in across the chimney from one side to the other. Hans pulled the rope by one of its ends. The other rose in the air. After passing the higher rock, it came down again, bringing with it a rather dangerous shower of bits of stone and lava. Leaning over the edge of our narrow standing ground, I observed that the bottom of the hole was still invisible. The same maneuver was repeated with the cord, and half an hour after we had descended another 200 feet. I don't suppose the maddest geologist under such circumstances would have studied the nature of the rocks that we were passing. I am sure I did trouble my head about them. Pliocene, Miocene, Eocene, Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, Carboniferous, Devonian, Silurian, or primitive was all one to me. But the professor, no doubt, was pursuing his observations or taking notes, for in one of our halts he said to me, "The farther I go, the more confidence I feel. The order of these volcanic formations affords the strongest confirmation to the series of Davy. They are now among the primitive rocks upon which the chemical operations took place, which are produced by the contact of elementary bases of metals with water. I repudiate the notion of central heat altogether. We shall see further proof of that very soon." No variation, always the same conclusion. Of course, I was not inclined to argue. My silence was taken for consent, and the descent went on. Another 3 hours, and I saw no bottom to the chimney yet. When I lifted my head, I perceived the gradual contraction of its aperture. Its walls, by a gentle incline, were drawing closer to each other, and it was beginning to grow darker. Still, we kept descending. It seemed to me that the falling stones were meeting with an earlier resistance, and that the concussion gave a more abrupt and deaded sound. As I had taken care to keep an exact account of our maneuvers with the rope, which I knew that we had repeated 14 times, each descent occupying half an hour, the conclusion was easy, that we had been 7 hours plus 14 quarters of rest, making 10 hours and a half. We had started at 1. It must therefore now be 11 o'clock, and the depths to which we had descended was 14 times 200 feet, or 2,800 feet. At this moment I heard the voice of Hans. "Halt!" he cried. I stopped short, just as I was going to place my feet upon my uncle's head. "We are there!" he cried. "Where?" said I, stepping near to him. "At the bottom of the perpendicular chimney," he answered. "Is there no way farther?" "Yes, there is a sort of passage which inclines to the right. We will see about that tomorrow. Let us have our supper and go to sleep." The darkness was not yet complete. The provision case was opened. We refreshed ourselves and went to sleep as well as we could upon a bed of stones and lava fragments. When, lying on my back, I opened my eyes and saw a bright, sparkling point of light at the extremity of the gigantic tube, 3,000 feet long, now a vast telescope. It was a star which, seen from this depth, had lost all scintillation.
Scintillation.
Scintillation, a flash or sparkle of light. It was a star which, seen from this depth, had lost all scintillation, and which by my computation should be 46 Ursa Minor. Then I fell fast asleep. Chapter 18. The Wonders of Terrestrial Depths. At 8 in the morning, a ray of daylight came to wake us up. The 1,000 shining surfaces of lava on the walls received it on its passage and scattered it like a shower of sparks. There was light enough to distinguish surrounding objects. "Well, Axel, what do you say to it?" cried my uncle, rubbing his hands. "Did you ever spend a quieter night in our little house at Königsberg? No noise of cartwheels, no cries of basket women, no boatmen shouting." "No doubt it is very quiet at the bottom of this well, but there is something alarming in the quietness itself." "Now come," my uncle cried. "If you are frightened already, what will you be by and by? We have not gone a single inch yet into the bowels of the earth." "What do you mean?" "I mean that we have only reached the level of the island. Long vertical tube, which terminates at the mouth of the crater, has its lower end only at the level of the sea." "Are you sure of that?" "Quite sure. Consult the barometer." In fact, the mercury, which had risen in the instrument as fast as we descended, had stopped at 29 inches. "You see," said the professor, we have now only the pressure of our atmosphere, and I shall be glad when the aneroid takes the place of the barometer." And in truth, this instrument would become useless as soon as the weight of the atmosphere should exceed the pressure ascertained at the level of the sea. "What," I said, "is there not reason to fear that this ever-increasing pressure will become at last very painful to bear?" "No, we shall descend at a slow rate, and our lungs will become inured to a denser atmosphere. Aeronauts find the want of air as they rise to high elevations, but we shall perhaps have too much. Of the two, this is what I should prefer. Don't let us lose a moment. Where is the bundle we sent down before us?" I then remembered that we had searched for it in vain the evening before. My uncle questioned Hans, who, after having examined attentively with the eye of a huntsman, replied, "Der Hüb! Up there?" And so it was. The bundle had been caught by a projection 100 feet above us. Immediately the Icelander climbed up like a cat, and in a few minutes the package was in our possession. "Now," said my uncle, "let us breakfast, but we must lay in a good stock, for we don't know how long we may have to go on." The biscuit and extract of meat were washed down with a draught of water, mingled with a little gin. Breakfast over, my uncle drew from his pocket a small notebook intended for scientific observations. He consulted his instruments and recorded: Monday, July 1, chronometer 8:17 a.m. Barometer 297 inches. Thermometer 6 degrees, 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Direction east by southeast. This last observation applied to the dark gallery and was indicated by the compass. "Now, Axel," cried the professor with enthusiasm, "now we are really going into the interior of the earth. At this precise moment, the journey commences." So saying, my uncle took in one hand Ruhmkorff's apparatus, which was hanging from his neck, and with the other he formed an electric communication with the coil in the lantern, and a sufficiently bright light dispersed the darkness of the passage. Hans carried the other apparatus, which was also put into action. This ingenious application of electricity would enable us to go on for a long time by creating an artificial light, even in the midst of the most inflammable gases. "Now, march!" cried my uncle. Each shouldered his package. Hans drove before him the load of cords and clothes, and myself, walking last, we entered the gallery. At the moment of becoming engulfed in this dark gallery, I raised my head and saw for the last time through the length of that vast tube the sky of Iceland, which I was never to behold again. The lava, in the last eruption of 1229, had forced a passage through this tunnel. It still lined the walls with a thick and glistening coat. The electric light was here, intensified 100-fold by reflection. The only difficulty in proceeding lay in not sliding too fast down an incline of about 45 degrees. Happily, certain asperities and a few blisterings here and there formed steps, and we descended, letting our baggage slip before us from the end of a long rope. But that which formed steps under our feet became stalactites overhead. The lava, which was porous in many places, had formed a surface covered with small rounded blisters, crystals of opaque quartz, set with limpid tiers of glass, and hanging like clustered chandeliers from the vaulted roof, seemed as if it were to kindle and form a sudden illumination as we passed on our way. It seemed as if the genie of the depths,
Genii.
genii, plural form of genie, genius, brilliance, talent. It seemed as if the genii of the depths were lighting up their palace to receive their terrestrial guests. "It is magnificent!" I cried spontaneously. "My uncle, what a sight! Don't you admire those blending hues of lava, passing from reddish brown to bright yellow by imperceptible shades? And these crystals are just like globes of light." "Ali, you think so, do you, Axel, my boy? Well, you will see greater splendors than these, I hope. Now let us march! March!" He had better have said slide, for we did nothing but drop down the steep inclines. It was Facif's Descensus Averni of Virgil. The compass, which I consulted frequently, gave our direction as southeast with inflexible steadiness. This lava stream deviated neither to the right nor to the left. Yet there was no sensible increase of temperature. This justified Davy's theory, and more than once I consulted the thermometer with surprise. 2 hours after our departure, it only marked 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, an increase of only 4 degrees. This gave reason for believing that our descent was more horizontal than vertical. As for the exact depths reached, it was very easy to ascertain that the professor measured accurately the angles of deviation and inclination on the road, but he kept the results to himself. About eight in the evening, he signaled to stop. Hans sat down at once. The lamps were hung upon a projection in the lava. We were in a sort of cavern where there was plenty of air. Certain puffs of air reached us. What atmospheric disturbance was the cause of them? I could not answer that question at the moment. Hunger and fatigue made me incapable of reasoning. A descent of 7 hours consecutively is not made without considerable expenditure of strength. I was exhausted. The order to halt therefore gave me pleasure. Hans laid our provisions upon a block of lava, and we ate with a good appetite. But one thing troubled me. Our supply of water was half consumed. My uncle reckoned upon a fresh supply from subterranean sources, but hitherto we had met with none. I could not help drawing his attention to this circumstance. "Are you surprised at this want of springs?" he said. "More than that, I am anxious about it. we have only water enough for 5 days. Don't be uneasy, Axel. We shall find more than we want. When? When we have left this bed of lava behind us. How could springs break through such walls as these? But perhaps this passage runs to a very great depth. It seems to me that we have made no great progress vertically. Why do you suppose that? Because if we had gone deep into the crust of the earth, we should have encountered greater heat. According to your system, said my uncle. What does the thermometer say? Hardly 15 degrees. 59 degrees Fahrenheit. 9 degrees only since our departure. Well, what is your conclusion? This is my conclusion. According to exact observations, the increase of temperature in the interior of the globe advances at the rate of 1 degree, 1 to 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, for every 100 feet. But certain local conditions may modify this rate. Thus, at Yakutsk in Siberia, the increase of a degree is ascertained to be reached every 36 feet. This difference depends upon the heat conducting power of the rocks. Moreover, in the neighborhood of an extinct volcano through Genes, Nice, a metamorphic rock with a banded or foliated structure, typically coarse-grained and consisting mainly of feldspar, quartz, and mica. Genes. Moreover, in the neighborhood of an extinct volcano through Genes, it has been observed that the increase of a degree is only attained at every 125 feet. Let us therefore assume that this hypothesis as the most suitable to our situation and calculate. Well, do calculate, my boy. Nothing is easier, said I, putting down figures in my notebook. 9 times 125 feet gives a depth of 1125 feet. Very accurate indeed. Well, by my observations, we are at 10,000 feet below the level of the sea. Is that possible? Yes, or figures are of no use. The professor's calculations were quite correct. We had already attained a depth of 6,000 feet beyond that hitherto reached by the foot of man, such as the mines of Kitzbühel in Tyrol and those of Württemberg in Bohemia. The temperature, which ought to have been 81 degrees Celsius or 178 degrees Fahrenheit, was scarcely 15 degrees Celsius, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Here was cause for reflection. Chapter 19. Geological Studies in Situ. Next day, Tuesday, June 30th, at 6 o'clock a.m., the descent began again. We were still following the gallery of lava, a real natural staircase, and as gently sloping as those inclined planes which in some old houses are still found instead of flights of steps. And so we went on until 12:17, the precise moment when we overtook Hans, who had stopped. "Ah, here we are!" exclaimed my uncle, "at the very end of the chimney." I looked around me. We were standing at the intersection of 2 roads, both dark and narrow. Which were we to take? This was a difficulty. Still my uncle refused to admit an appearance of hesitation, either before me or the guide. He pointed out the eastern tunnel, and we were soon all three in it. Besides, there would have been interminable hesitation before this choice of roads, for since there was no indication whatever to guide our choice, we were obliged to trust to chance. The slope of this gallery was scarcely perceptible, and its sections very unequal. Sometimes we passed a series of arches, succeeded each other like the majestic arcades of a Gothic cathedral. Here the architects of the Middle Ages might have found studies for every form of the sacred art which sprang from the development of the pointed arch. A mile further we had to bow our heads under corniced elliptic arches in the Romanesque style, and massive pillars standing out from the wall bent under the spring of the vault that rested heavily upon them. In other places this magnificence gave way to narrow channels between low structures which looked like beavers' huts, and we had to creep along through extremely narrow passages. The heat was perfectly bearable. Involuntarily I began to think of its heat when the lava thrown out by Snæfell was boiling and working through this now silent road. I imagined the torrents of fire hurled back at every angle in the gallery, and the accumulation of intensity heated vapors in the midst of this confined channel. I only hope, thought I, that this so-called extinct volcano won't take a fancy in his old age to begin his sport again. I abstained from communicating these fears to Professor Liedenbrock. He would never have understood them at all. He had but one idea: forward. He walked, he slid, he scrambled, he tumbled with a persistency which one could not but admire. But 6 in the evening, after a not very fatiguing walk, we had gone 2 leagues south, but scarcely a quarter of a mile down. My uncle said it was time to go to sleep. We ate without talking and went to sleep without reflection. Our arrangements for the night were very simple. A railway rug each, into which we rolled ourselves, was our sole covering. We had neither cold nor intrusive visits to fear. Travelers who penetrate into the wilds of Central Africa and into the pathless forests of the New World are obliged to watch over each other by night. But we enjoyed absolute safety and utter seclusion. No savages or wild beasts infested these silent depths. Next morning we awoke fresh and in good spirits. The road was resumed. As the day before, we followed the path of the lava. It was impossible to tell what rocks we were passing. The tunnel, instead of tending lower, approached more and more nearly to a horizontal direction. I even fancied a slight rise. But about 10, this upward tendency became so evident, and therefore so fatiguing, that I was obliged to slacken my pace. "Well, Axel?" demanded the professor impatiently. Well, I cannot stand it any longer, I replied. What? After 3 hours' walk over such easy ground? It may be easy, but it is tiring all the same. What? Then we have nothing to do but keep going down. Going up, if you please. Going up, said my uncle with a shrug. No doubt. For the last half hour, the inclines have gone the other way, and at this rate we shall soon arrive upon the level soil of Iceland. The professor nodded slowly and uneasily, like a man that declines to be convinced. I tried to resume the conversation. He answered not a word, and gave the signal for a start. I saw that his silence was nothing but ill humor. Still, I had courageously shouldered my burden again, and was rapidly following Hans, whom my uncle preceded. I was anxious not to be left behind. My greatest care was not to lose sight of my companions. I shuddered at the thought of being lost in the mazes of this vast subterranean labyrinth. Besides, if the ascending road did become steeper, I was comforted with the thought that it was bringing us nearer to the surface. There was hope in this. Every step confirmed me in it, and I was rejoicing at the thought of meeting my little Groban again. By midday, there was a change in the appearance of this wall of the gallery. I noticed it by a diminution of the amount of light reflected from the sides. Solid rock was appearing in the place of the lava coating. The mass was composed of inclined and sometimes vertical strata. We were passing through rocks of the transition or Silurian system. It is evident, I cried. The marine deposits formed in the second period, these shales, limestones and sandstones, we are turning away from the primary granite. We are just as if we were people of Hamburg going to Lübeck by way of Hanover. I had better have kept my observations to myself, but my geological instinct was stronger than my prudence, and Uncle Liedenbrock heard my exclamation. What's that you are saying? He asked. See, I said, pointing to the varied series of sandstones and limestones and the first indication of slate. Well? We are at the period when the first plants and animals appeared. Do you think so? Look close and examine. I obliged the professor to move his lamp over the walls of the gallery. I expected some signs of astonishment, but he spoke not a word and went on. Had he understood me or not? Did he refuse to admit, out of self-love as an uncle and a philosopher, that he had mistaken his way when he chose the eastern tunnel? Or was he determined to examine this passage to its farthest extremity? It was evident that we had left the lava path, and that this road could not possibly lead to the extinct furnace of Snaefell. Yet I asked myself if I was not depending too much on this change in the rock. Might I not myself be mistaken? Were we really crossing the layers of rock which overlie the granite foundation? If I am right, I thought, I must soon find some fossil remains of primitive life. And then we must yield to evidence. I will look. I had not gone 100 paces before incontestable proofs presented themselves. It could not be otherwise, for in the Silurian age, the seas contained at least 1,500 vegetable and animal species. My feet which had become accustomed to the indurated lava floor, suddenly rested upon a dust composed of the debris of plants and shells. In the walls were distinct impressions of fucoids and lycopodites. Professor Liedenbrock could not be mistaken, I thought, and yet he pushed on with, I suppose, his eyes resolutely shut. This was only invincible obstinacy. I could hold out no longer. I picked up a perfectly formed shell which had belonged to an animal not unlike the woodlouse. Then, joining my uncle, I said, "Look at this!" "Very well," he said quietly. "It is the shell of a crustacean of an instinct species called a trilobite, nothing more." "But don't you conclude?" "Just what you conclude yourself. Yes, I do perfectly. We have left the granite and the lava. It is possible that I may be mistaken, but I cannot be sure of that until I have reached the very end of this gallery." "You are right in doing this, my uncle, and I should quite approve of your determination if there were not a danger threatening us nearer and nearer." "What danger?" "The want of water." "Well, Axel, we will put ourselves upon rations."